Hi, I'm Alyssa Maki, and I'm currently a student at Metropolitan State. I've created this video project and presentation for my computer security class, ICS 382, with instructor Jennifer Grant. And a disclaimer, the content of this video is for educational purposes only, and I am not liable for any damages that could be caused by using any of these demonstrations. And so I chose the topic of user and entity behavior analytics, or UEBA, for this project after attending a security conference, Student 360, which is the student version of Secure 360. And one of the presentations I saw that day was a brief explanation of UEBA, and I just thought it was a really intriguing topic. I kind of liked the intersection of technology, security, human psychology, and data patterns. So without further ado, let's jump into this a little bit more. So what is UEBA? So a quick explanation of UEBA is that it is a program that allows you to collect data on normal usage in a system and then applies algorithms and machine learning to understand what is normal in that system. We can then be alerted when something abnormal is happening. So UBA versus UEBA. So there's two terms that are used kind of interchangeably, UBA and UEBA. Basically, UBA is an older term and only means to apply to users. And as time has gone on, though, we've seen it more, it's applied more liberally. So now we include entity to the title to include more than just the system's users. So then there's a second fairly similar term or concept to UEBA, which is SIEM, or Security, Information, and Event Management. So where UEBA focuses on user behaviors, SIEM focuses on the technology of the system. Given that the A in UEBA stands for analytics, it makes sense that the primary focus is to analyze data, which it does to determine what is normal in a system and thereby creates rules of what is normal versus abnormal. SIEM primarily will use predetermined rules to see when a system is acting normally, whereas UEBA will just analyze data to create its own rules. Typically, SIEM is more useful for quick reaction to real-time situations related to the technology within a system. UEBA is more useful for both quick reactions and then recognizing long-term deviations from normalcy. Since they are so different in their methods, but really similar in their goals, they could be used together to create an even more robust security system. So a brief history of UEBA. UEBA started originally as a way to study customers to better recommend products. Major companies such as Amazon and Netflix use users' behaviors, interests, and previous purchases to create product recommendations. But however, in late 2013, there was a target data breach. So UEBA began to creep into the security realm after that. That breach wasn't caught in time by traditional security methods. So when Target and a few others that experienced breaches around the same time revamped their systems, they began to look into this new type of technology. Unfortunately, though, the machine learning algorithms at the time created a lot of false alerts that sent security teams scrambling. So people sought to improve the technology that they had to create better and better methods for collecting and analyzing user and entity behaviors. So then why do we need UEBA? Basically, the why do we need it relates to what does UEBA do that other forms of security can't do. We saw when compared to SIEM that we have the technology to create rules and alerts when those rules are broken. But UEBA allows us to really study our environment and respond quickly to abnormal behavior. It's more flexible. It creates its own rules. With SIEM and other methods of security, they depend really deeply on well-written rules, and they rarely catch the slow long-term attacks. Basically, most of our current monitoring systems can be worked around in one way, form, or another. But UEBA is much more difficult to weasel around because you would have to completely alter how a system and its users behave in order to trick it. Easily the biggest need for UEBA is for studying our users. So often it is an internal attack, whether intentional or not, that leads to major security breaches. So if we know how all of our users regularly behave, if one of them starts to act suspicious, we can catch it. So let's look at insider threats a little bit more. I wonder if I can pop my video out here. Okay. So when looking at various security breaches and issues, we so often find a human as the weak point in our security system that allowed the attack to happen. They usually fall into one of two categories, either intentional or unintentional insider threats. So the intentional insider threats are users that exist within the system and for whatever reason decide to help breach the system. This can be a disgruntled employee that decided to infect the system with malware just to wreak havoc. It can be an employee that accepts money in order to create some sort of vulnerability in the system for an attacker. And it can also be an employee stealing intellectual property for any reason. Unintentional insider threats are users that exist within the system and make some kind of error that creates a vulnerability in the system. This can be anyone that uses easy to guess passwords or leaves their username and passwords unattended. They can also be users that unintentionally share any kind of information, like intellectual property, usernames, passwords, personal information, etc., with an untrusted party. Unintentional threats can also be employees that click on or download any sort of malware to the system. Think like phishing scams and emails. So now that we've looked at the many, but probably not all of the insider threats, we can link this back to UEBA. By analyzing user and entity behaviors, we can create a baseline of what is normal on a system. Once something starts acting abnormally, we can catch it. We can see when users download a .exe file, if that's not something they typically do. We can catch a user that's sending intellectual property to an external email. We can see if a user starts accessing unusual parts of the system, say if their account had been hacked. And we can answer questions like, does a lower level employee need access to files related to intellectual property? Even if they're requesting that and getting granted that access, is that normal for that user or that group of users? It can also compare a user's behavior to that of their group. Does an accountant in like a group of accountants, does that person usually download massive files or print vast quantities of items off the server? Is a user trying to elevate their privileges or ask for access to things that they don't need access to for their job? Basically, UEBA allows us to see all the small steps leading up to an attack before it would trigger any of our traditional rule-based monitoring systems. So, specific areas of security that UEBA protects. So, looking at those, we discussed the concept of insider threats, and a lot of these do relate to insider threats, but the insider threats can have a variety of effects on the enterprise that they made vulnerable. And so some of the areas listed here could be caused by an insider threat. And many of these bullet points are difficult to detect with traditional monitoring systems because they're caused within the system by a trusted user or entity. So UEBA can detect compromised user credentials because usually if a user's account has been compromised, it starts acting abnormally and therefore would set off alarms within a UEBA system that wouldn't be caught by traditional monitoring because it's a trusted person doing these things. Privileged users are also a really common attack target, so those are especially important to monitor for unusual activity, and most UEBA platforms allow you to specifically look at those groups of people that are privileged users. UEBA can monitor the movement of various assets, both like monetary and then also intellectual property. So again, if something is happening that's abnormal, it can be caught. Things are moving where they shouldn't be or being sent out to places they shouldn't be, we can detect that. Data exfiltration can be a challenging one to detect with other monitoring systems because it's fairly common for businesses to send out data. However, UEBA can detect who is sending it out, how much they're sending out, and whether or not that's normal for that user. This can help catch the theft of intellectual property or personal information stored within the company. UEBA can help with repeated failed logins and account lockouts. They do that by collecting data on an account and its users' behaviors, so administrators can make really quick data-driven decisions on whether or not to unlock an account for a given user. It also relates to the last bullet point, security alert and investigation and response time, because UEBA's purpose is to make administrator and security teams' jobs easier and more efficient. So any kind of alert that pops up can be quickly investigated and decisions can be made quickly to protect a system, whereas older, more monitoring systems require you to slog through tons and tons of data yourself. The UEBA system does that for you. So then UEBA can also be used to monitor and detect misuse of service accounts and systems, hosts, devices, etc., that many other monitoring systems find difficult to track if they indeed track them at all. So where is UEBA used? And who might benefit from using this security method? So since it's such a flexible tool that learns from its environment, it could be deployed in both large and small enterprises. However, typically the larger entities will see more use out of it. This is because that the products that can do these analytics tend to be pretty expensive. So usually smaller or not as profitable enterprises might have difficulty justifying the cost. So mom and pop places, the public sector, especially school districts, and to some extent the healthcare industry might not be able to afford this kind of security. Unfortunately, those are all areas that we've seen a lot of breaches and ransomware popping up in recently. So they're probably also lacking in other security systems. However, if an organization can afford to use UEBA, they might find it especially useful if they've had issues with stolen intellectual property, previous data breaches, or traditional SIEM type monitoring systems are maxed out for their system. So the first two issues, stolen IP and previous data breaches, also helps overcome the issue of cost for most organizations. They clearly see the cost of not having a robust security system, so they're more willing to shell out the money for another variation of monitoring. So those are all the benefits of UEBA, but let's talk about some of the issues with it. So UEBA and privacy. Whenever we talk about collecting vast amounts of data on a group of people, there should be some concern for all participants. What is collected and how it is used will depend on the enterprise collecting the it will depend on the enterprise collecting the data and what program they use for their UEBA services. So let's see if I can hide myself here for a second. There we go. So one major concern for privacy in the workplace is that of bring your own device policies. By using a personal device for the purpose of doing work, your employer will likely need to implement some security features on that device. This can mean that an employer may be able to track your device usage, locations, applications, etc. Again, what is collected will depend on the enterprise and their security policies. So next up, let's see, I'll just hide myself for a second so you can read that. So current laws and legal concerns, UEBA and the law. In the United States, we have a scattered patchwork quilt of data privacy laws. This can leave users a bit vulnerable to their employers regarding what data they want to collect and how it's stored or used. For employers, it can be kind of problematic because the policies you use in one state won't necessarily work for another state. This is confounded even more so by the Data Protection Acts implemented in the European Union and United Kingdom, which created more organized and stringent laws than those we see in the US. So if you're an international company, the data protection laws vary from country to country, so your employees may be protected differently in other parts of the world. All right, programs that use UEBA. Obviously, those are really small. Let's see. So basically, this shows that there's already a really vast field of vendors that can supply some variation of a UEBA product. These were ranked to be the top 20 UEBA vendors according to eSecurity Planet. And these same vendors also showed up on several other ranking lists. In order to be included, they had to monitor and analyze user and entity behavior, detect abnormal behavior, use advanced analytics to detect threats, offer the ability to correlate multiple abnormal activities that could indicate a single event threat, and then provide at least near real-time performance, if not real-time performance. And so in the next couple of slides, we'll show how these platforms look to the actual user, focusing on Preempt, Splunk, and Securonics, which you can see there with the arrows. So how does UEBA look to the user? Whenever I am learning about a new technology or concept, I always like to see what the user of a typical program would actually see when using it. So we'll explore just a couple of the basic screens someone might encounter when using a UEBA platform. So first off, we have this screen from Preempt, and I will hide my thing so it's not covering this up. There we go. One of our biggest components of UEBA is being able to track individual users, groups of users, and entities. So of all the platforms I looked at, I saw some kind of screen similar to this in which an analyst can track user behavior to see trends over time and specific alerts. So you can see that some of them did charts like this, some of them did pie graphs or any sort of other little graphic that they wanted to use, but you could always kind of go by, different users or groups of users or, privileged users versus regular users. So there are lots of different ways to break down the data. So next we have this screen from Splunk, and I will once again hide myself for a second so you can look at it. So this shows the detected threats, which is obviously a pretty necessary component of any UEBA program in security usage. Most programs will provide rankings for how critical a threat or behavior might be. Some broke it down by type of threat, or in this case, where it fits into the threat kill chain. That's this thing on the bottom of their screen there. So that's Splunk. And then this is a screen from Securonics. And this shows an additional feature that wasn't necessarily a requirement to be included in the top 20 vendors list. And that it allows the user or analyst to take actions within the actual platform. They call it, in this case, a cyber threat incident playbook, and it creates recommended steps to fix an incident, and those can be automated from within the platform. So then, let's see. Future uses. So based on what we've covered so far, it makes sense that UEBA is a large and growing larger aspect of enterprise security. It's growing at a compound annual growth rate of 48% per year, which makes it one of the fastest growing areas of security. And that's according to Gartner. It's able to take in massive amounts of data and synthesize it into smaller feeds of alerts. And it gives higher quality information to analysts. So it prevents false alarms, and the information it gives is not so overwhelming to analysts. So they can really focus in on what is important, which is obviously a pretty nice tool if that's your job. So this wraps up my presentation on user and entity behavior analytics. We got a taste for what it is, how it's useful, what it looks like, the areas of security that it helps address, legal and ethical concerns, especially regarding massive amounts of data being collected, and then how UEBA might expand into the future. So listed are my sources for the information in this presentation. I hope you enjoyed it and learned a little bit about something that I find really interesting. Thank you.